Welcome to APUSH. Today we're going to be discussing the ideas of American imperialism in order to kick off Unit 7 here. So, here are your objectives for today, and let's dive into our story. The question of American imperialism is one that we've been talking about for a while because, to some degree, the United States becomes an empire during this unit. But as we discussed previously, to some extent, the United States is already an empire. We've been acquiring territories that don't technically connect to the United States for a while now, with the example being the purchase of Russia, of Russian America, or as we call it today, Alaska, in 1868, which gave us this bear infested wasteland in the north that was known as Seward's Folly until first gold and then oil was discovered there. And then we decided that maybe Alaska was a little bit more valuable than we thought. We had also been extending foreign powers abroad. Remember the Perry expedition from last unit to Japan? And so, to some extent, the United States is going to change its sort of path and become an empire during this unit. But to some extent, we've been doing this for a while. And so, this will be a question that we'll be debating in class for sure. One of the factors that led to our increasingly aggressive foreign policy is something called jingoism. Jingoism is a type of sort of hyper nationalism that we saw rise during this unit, and its biggest proponents are people like Henry Cabot Lodge here, who's a noted Republican politician, and then Theodore Roosevelt, who's going to be one of the strongest jingos. To some extent, this policy just builds upon Manifest Destiny and some of the stuff written by John O'Sullivan, but to some extent, it also echoes some of the European imperialist beliefs about racial superiority and spreading light to the quote unquote dark areas of the world. And so we'll let you decide to what extent you think it's a continuation versus a departure. One thing is absolutely sure, though, and that's the idea that if the United States is going to continue to expand, we must become a great sea power. And so, um, most of the American jingos were reading books like The Influence of Sea Power Upon History by Alfred Thayer Mahan, who is a historian, who argued that all great world empires have to be sea powers. And so we get this push to modernize and create our own sort of battleship fleet during this time period, which is going to become super useful when we get into a little tiff with Spain over the island of Cuba. So, America now builds this, really expensive battleship navy and gets involved in the whole naval arms race thing. So that's super exciting. With this, of course, the Jingos were sort of looking for an opportunity to test this. The idea that the United States needs a coming out party on the world stage to prove that we really belong with the great powers of England and Russia and Prussia and some of these other old European powers. And so a lot of the Jingos were to some degree spoiling for a fight when the crisis that got us into the Spanish American War happened. At the same time, you have to remember the context is this is the age of imperialism. And so more all of the countries of Europe were partaking in this whole imperialist endeavor, and the United States was watching as Great Britain especially, but also, everyone all the other European powers were sort of enjoying the spoils of war, so to speak, as they captured territory abroad and then began exploiting that territory for its natural resources. The United States, up until this point, had not been involved in any of this because, quite frankly, we have substantial natural resources in the United States to exploit. But that didn't mean that, at least for the Jingos, it wasn't a matter of national shame that the United States wasn't grabbing colonies the same way the great powers of Europe were. And so there was some pressure in the United States to engage in this type of imperialism. The United States was also looking for a market for its foreign goods as our economy expanded rapidly in the years after the Civil War. And so we're going to be looking to secure access to foreign markets, which again, to some degree involves colonies and to some degree involves increased naval power. The Venezuelan crisis gave us the first chance to sort of test out our mettle on the world stage. And it was a crisis between Venezuela and Great Britain. And Germany was sort of trying to weasel their way in there too. But it's mostly Venezuela and Great Britain. And it was an issue over a border dispute between British Guiana and Venezuela. Basically, England thought that they should get more territory or the borders of British Guiana should extend further into what Venezuela thought was their territory. And so Venezuela asked the United States for arbitration. And the United States firmly reminded England that the Monroe Doctrine says that you can't interfere with issues in the Americas. As you hopefully remember from Unit 4, we'd never actually enforced this part of the Monroe Doctrine before, but it was always stated policy since the 1820s, and so this is the first opportunity for us to stand up to England. And so we stood up to England by demanding that we lead the committee to decide what the border was, and then we immediately decided that the border was exactly where England said it was. And so England wins the Venezuelan crisis, but it's relevant for us because they won it because we said they could win it, not because they were trying to get more territory in the Americas. So it's a moral victory. Look, it's a second term Grover Cleveland standing up to the King of England and twisting his tail. Way to go, America. Then you've got the island of Hawaii. Hopefully, you're familiar with Hawaii. It's an island out in the middle of the Pacific, and it obviously had was relatively fertile, and so American sugar and fruit planters had been settling in Hawaii for some time, buying up significant tracts of land and then hiring the native Hawaiians to work them. Specifically, the Dole family became incredibly involved in this. You might know the Dole Fruit Company that was one of the main companies expanding into this area. And so, for a while, the relationship was somewhat symbiotic, but over time, the Hawaiians began to feel exploited by the really poor working conditions and eventually the importation of cheaper Filipino and Japanese labor to work on this plantation. So, the Queen of Hawaii, Leolukalani, proposed, or when she came to power in 1891, proposed changing the Hawaiian constitution in order to both protect the rights of workers and provide more political power to the average Hawaiians. This freaked us out because the Dole Fruit Company didn't necessarily want the Hawaiians to have more political autonomy, and they were worried that it would then disrupt the flow of labor into Hawaii and cut into their lucrative revenue streams. And so what you ended up getting was a coup in which agents of the Dole Fruit Company, backed by the tacit support of American Marines, decided to overthrow the government of Hawaii and then apply for annexation. So Stanford Dole, pictured here, became the president, quote unquote, of the Republic, quote unquote, of Hawaii, and Leo Lukalani was forced from power. A referendum amongst the Hawaiian people showed that they did not support the new government and they did not support annexation. And so the Cleveland administration really sort of tried to not rule on this, as Cleveland was not really a fan of imperialism. But once William McKinley came into power, now but once William McKinley came into power, now all bets are off. And McKinley's going to push a Hawaiian annexation treaty. And then, especially after we go to war with Spain, it becomes apparent that having islands in the Pacific to be recoaling stations would be incredibly good for the United States' ability to project its power. And so eventually, Hawaii is annexed into the United States. The Queen ends up actually suing the United States government to try to restore some of her autonomy. It goes all the way to the Supreme Court, and of course, they rule against the Hawaiians, and so Hawaii becomes a territory and then a state. So that's fun. But the big issue that kicks off this whole American imperialism thing is the crisis in Cuba. The Cuban people were one of the last sort of remnants of the Spanish Empire. As you hopefully remember, in the 1820s, most of Spanish American territories declared independence, but the Spanish held on to Cuba for both economic reasons, but also for national pride reasons, as it was like the last remnant of their once great global spanning empire. And so Spain was loath to give up this territory. The United States continued to invest in this area, and eventually, absentee American landowners would own a significant portion of the sort of productive capacity of Cuba. But at the same time, so American influences in Cuba is growing. At the same time, the Cuban people had been fighting the Spanish for independence on and off for the last about 50 years. But in the late 1800s, this battle became increasingly problematic and bloody. And so we were somewhat concerned both that Cuba would that this war for independence might lead to the destruction of American assets, but we were also somewhat concerned that if Cuba got independence, they might nationalize American assets and our ability to make money off sugar plantations would then dry up. So we feared both the continued Spanish rule and also Cuban independence. So what do we do about this whole thing? Well, we start growing forces within the United States start to advocate getting more involved in Cuba, especially as the Spanish tactics to try to put down this rebellion become increasingly harsh. For example, the Spanish general basically put the Cuban people in camps and then stopped feeding them. He divided up the island into a couple different military districts, put all the Cuban people in camps, and then started massacring everyone outside the camps, and the Cuban people started to starve. So, as pictures of starving Cubans start to show up in the American press, pressure grows on the McKinley administration to do something about this. I mean, Cuba's an island that's 90 miles off of our border, and there are literally people starving there, and also our sugar plantations are being burned down, which one of those two things is hopefully going to stir most Americans to action. So we dispatched a battleship to Cuba in order to just take stock of the situation and try to pressure the Spanish to ease up on the Cubans and do something about this situation. So this is the second class battleship Maine, which sails into Havana Harbor. And for a while, for a couple days, it seems like everything's fine. The rebels calm down. The Spanish actually start getting food to the Cuban people, and this crisis seems like it might be averted. And then the Maine blows up. So with the USS Maine now destroyed, we have this question of what the heck happened? The newspapers, specifically the newspapers run by Joseph Pulitzer and William Randolph Hearst, start screaming that clearly the Spanish attacked the Maine, that the battleships don't just blow up, which admittedly battleships do just blow up sometimes, but the headlines clearly point to the idea of Spanish treachery. It's a concept known as yellow journalism, where newspapers try to publish sensationalistic headlines in order to more or less sell papers and also affect public opinion. You'll notice here that they never actually say that the Spanish destroyed the Maine, but all of these headlines sort of imply that that happened. And so public pressure builds and builds and builds and builds, and then the naval report comes out that says that the Spanish were responsible for the destruction of the Maine, and then McKinley has no choice but to declare war. The Spanish-American War is one of the most decisive wars in American history, in that we utterly destroy the Spanish. I'm not going to get into too many details here. It's a fascinating conflict, and you can look it up if you're interested. But there's basically two theaters of war. First, we send a flotilla of ships to the Philippines in order to try to fight the Spanish Pacific Fleet. This fleet was ordered there actually before war broke out by Undersecretary of the Navy Theodore Roosevelt, which shows exactly how he felt about what we should be doing here. And this battleship fleet utterly destroyed the Spanish fleet. The Spanish fleet was a few years out of date. Our ships could fire and hit the Spanish fleet at significantly longer ranges, and our gunners were just frankly better. And so we just eviscerated the Spanish fleet in Manila Bay without losing a ship, and then we launched an assault on Cuba itself. The assault on Cuba was actually quite a fiasco. We didn't have enough ships, didn't have enough supplies. We didn't have a standing army at this point. And so we basically created this situation where, if you could raise a group of soldiers, you could then lead them into battle. And if you could charter a boat yourself, you'd have to charter a boat yourself. But if you could get them to Cuba, then you could just fight. And so we had this train of civilian boats going to Cuba, but we didn't have enough feed for the horses. And so my favorite story from this is that there was just a trail of dead horses between Florida and Cuba because we just had no ability to keep our horses alive. But all of that didn't really matter. We recruited a significant number of troops who were willing to go fight, including a number of groups of African American soldiers who signed up in huge numbers to go and sort of liberate Cuba and prove their mettle. And this was also the crowning moment for Theodore Roosevelt, who had raised his own company of a combination of cowboys, Native Americans, and Ivy League sports stars. His company, known as the Rough Riders, would help lead the charge up the Battle of San Juan Hill, leading Teddy Roosevelt to become a national hero for his bravery in this battle. And so, in a relatively one sided conflict, we defeat Spain, force their surrender, and now we get all their colonies. So that's exciting. So, places like Cuba and Puerto Rico, and some islands in the Pacific, and the Philippines, and stuff like that. The problem with the Philippines is that we really would like to have the Philippines because the Philippines, a series of islands right off of the coast of Asia, would provide a very convenient recoaling station for our ships and allow us to increase our influence in Asia. So, on the one hand, having the Philippines relatively beneficial for the United States. On the other hand, the Filipinos have been fighting a pretty effective guerrilla war against the Spanish for a number of years at this point. And the leader of the Filipino resistance, Emilio Aguinaldo, had no interest in playing second fiddle to the United States and wanted independence. And so this kicks off the war against the Filipino War, in which, by basically using a series of racist arguments, we decide to crush Filipino resistance, and we crush Filipino resistance using some of the same counterinsurgency tactics that the Spanish used against the Cubans. We round up massive numbers of Filipinos, put them in camps, and then kill everyone not in the camps. And so there's mass slaughter. The number of accounts of just Americans going in and killing entire villages. And in the worst atrocity on one of the islands, our commander ordered that every single Filipino over the age of 10 should be killed. And so we committed what is sometimes called a genocide in order to suppress the Philippines. So there's that. And there's some question here as far as like, what does this mean for the United States if we're willing to do this? I like this political cartoon because it's clear that the artist has never seen a Filipino before. So I think that's really interesting. But on the plus side, we do get future President Taft riding a water buffalo when he was president, when he was the military or the he was the leader of the American forces in the Philippines, and so yeah, we'll put Taft on a water buffalo on the plus side of annexation of the Philippines. And then there's Cuba. Obviously, our goal in Cuba is to get the sugar plantations going again. And so, how do we end up doing that? Well, we're going to be involved in Cuba. So, we're going to organize a temporary military government and put a general in charge, and then pretty much support dictatorial rule in Cuba for the next about 60 years until the Cubans eventually overthrow our dictator, and then stuff between us and Cuba is going to get messy. Or, I mean, I guess you could probably argue it's already messy. So, before the war, we passed something called the Teller Amendment, which was pushed through by anti imperialist senators that said that we would not annex Cuba. But after the war, we passed something called the Platt Amendment, which, as you can see, allows us to intervene in Cuba whenever necessary. So, Cuba is not part of the United States, but it's also not totally independent. And we get Guantanamo Bay basically forever. So, that's cool. So the results of this, now we have all of these places that we can now teach how to be real people. So that's exciting. We also have proved ourselves on the world stage by beating up Spain, who admittedly not a first-rate power, but at least a European country. And we beat them really handily, so that makes us look good. So here's Colombia trying on her world power hat. So that's solid. And we've got an empire now. So we've got recoaling stations to help resupply our ships to project power around the world. So that's solid. But we're also going off this theoretical imperialism cliff without really knowing what to do with like Puerto Rico. Is it going to become a state? Is it not going to become a state? Is it going to be a territory without representation that we're going to hold in perpetuity? Only time will tell. So that brings us back to our objectives. Hopefully, you can provide some detailed answers to these questions, and we'll. I guess for some reason I didn't talk about the insular cases. I guess I'll talk about them now. The insular cases were a series of Supreme Court cases that basically ruled that the areas that we take over don't necessarily get the same rights under the Constitution as territories that are going to become states. And so the effect of the insular cases is it allows a justification for us to hold territories like Guam and and Puerto Rico in perpetuity, which we still hold to this day. So sorry about that.